So tonight we're gonna try to wrap up some loose ends with the Manichaeism. We still want to go into the cosmology and mythology of it and how it's influenced later people, and also maybe get into some potential um let's see, some potential
Like modern.
philosophical implications of it.
Yeah.
So I was thinking we would start because obviously the most famous responder and critic to the Manicheans is Augustine, right?
Hmm.
And he he was deep in there. He was a what do they call it, a hearer?
Yeah, he was a follower of the Manicheans for what, like 9 years?
Yeah, and he never, yeah, he was a hearer, so he never became an elect, which is interesting. He never took like the vows of a Manichean. He kind of just was, you know, throwing food for them to fart out and make the world a better place.
Yeah.
Um, so I wanted to just go through some of his disagreements with them because I also think it's interesting because a lot of his disagreements with the Manicheans, I think, come up again during the Reformation. So there's some like historical implications with this too. And also, we were talking with a person last night about what was it? Ethical empiricism, and we might see some of that come up tonight too.
Right, right.
I've never heard of ethical empiricism used that way, but I'm interested to explore that a little more. So I don't know if we'll go into that, but we'll keep an open mind to it.
Sure.
So the first thing that I wanted to go into was the idea of gnosis, right? This idea of wisdom. And it's like gnosis is a really weird term in these kind of Gnostic religions because it's very ambiguous. I mean, I don't know how much you've looked into the idea of gnosis, so maybe give me some idea.
Not a whole lot. I mean, I know it has something to do with knowledge.
Well, maybe a good way to start would be like, how would you separate knowledge from wisdom? Because I think gnosis gets translated as both, but in my mind, I conceptualize it more as wisdom. I don't have like a firm definition of wisdom in my head, whereas knowledge I kind of do.
Yeah, well, I guess I think of wisdom as something that is acquired through some particular process, whether it's experience or and maybe in some cases through like the divine, I guess.
Mhm. Well, I think both of us, we've talked about this a bit, but justified true belief for knowledge. Do you think that applies to wisdom as well?
Yeah, I was just thinking that. How would we, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know how we would translate JTB to wisdom without it just reducing down to a synonym for knowledge, right? But you're saying there's something distinct about wisdom that's different from knowledge.
Yeah, I'm wondering because to me, wisdom kind of like is more of a virtue where it's like you kind of look at a person and you know they're wise. It's like a habit of mind rather than it's like a formalized account of something.
Hmm.
That's how I kind of conceptualize it. So like you would see the wise man because he's doing wise things, and you kind of have like this recognition of that. And the acts, the works that he does shows that he's wise. Whereas a person who is exhibiting knowledge, they're knowledgeable, they would give you an account and they would have reasons you could look at the argument. But it's not really necessarily something they're doing other than the argument that they're giving you. In
Right.
fact, you could be a person that has knowledge and absolutely no wisdom.
Yeah, but what would that, I mean, I know like colloquially sometimes you hear people talk about like, I don't know, having book smarts as opposed to having wisdom or something. There's particularly in like modern kind of theory of everything kind of things, I tend to see this where like you see someone who's like kind of, oh, all of the other philosophers have kind of they've got this academic knowledge, but it's divorced from like practical applicability or something. So they might say that as like, all these like academic philosophers, they have knowledge, but they don't have wisdom or something like that.
I guess the way when I look at like people online that we discuss things with, or like people I meet day to day, and it's like they're sharing a lot of knowledge at me. They'll like spout out theories or isms or like
Mhm.
authors and kind of like have this air that they know what they're talking about. And I do believe that like they can follow the logic of the argument pretty well too. Like I don't think they're like just parroting necessarily. But at the same time, I feel like they don't really get what they're saying. It doesn't seem like they've thought it through in a wider system beyond that. So I really think wisdom is like the understanding of the system. And it's like a virtue of like being able to apply your knowledge in a very specific way. So I do think maybe knowledge is necessary, but not sufficient for wisdom.
Well, I wonder if a lot of it is to do with like, I mean, maybe this has always been the case. I don't know, but it seems like today there's kind of an impetus to look to certain philosophies or certain isms, certain particular little corners of philosophy's history as explanatory frameworks. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that necessarily. Um, but it is something that I've been wondering if there's any parallels between that and what might have motivated Mani to kind of develop this universalizing religious system where he comes out and says, all the other religions are great, except they're not compatible with each other. And I've come to make them all kind of, get along with each other. I'm going to unite all of the different religions that we have on offer. Um, and that's going to become like the new true path. Do you see any kind of parallels between that and sort of the culture that we are kind of embedded in terms of like internet philosophers and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I see it in academics too a little bit.
Hmm.
It's kind of like you have to know everything and unite everything in order to talk about anything. So then every conversation becomes this like very long, dragged out like account of the history of the world up to the point that you're at. So
Yeah.
it's very hard to get anywhere. Um, but it's always been a thing to some extent too. Like I've seen older writers do that as well. So I don't want to pretend like it's wholly a new thing. But I think Mani, what he wants to do is one, make a very expansive religion, like growth wise. Because Christianity and was already like a fast growing religion. So I think he wanted to like go with that momentum. And I think the other thing was I think he felt that there was something about all these religions that wasn't being said. And we get that from his kind of origin story that we talked about last time. Uh People are kind of like doing these like routines and sacraments and baptizing themselves, but rituals, but we don't really get any sense of a deeper meaning from it. And I think that his religion philosophy is speaking to that like want of a deeper meaning to the religious activities that people are doing. And I think maybe modern philosophy, one thing I get people saying, and maybe I think they're going about it the wrong way, is like they're trying to look for a deeper meaning in the philosophy because they feel kind of alienated from contemporary philosophy and academics and knowledge in some way, I think. Like that's a very
Yeah.
common theme for like almost every on all sides, people that are analytic, continental, whatever, they're all like, I hate the state of philosophy right now.
Yeah. Yeah, even I've kind of started to get on that train of kind of disliking academic philosophy. And it's, I don't know if it's ironic or perfectly predictable that I really only started to get into that mindset after I completed my degree. I feel like it could go one one way or the other. It's either irony or it's like, yeah, no, that's exactly what we expect would happen.
Yeah, and I wonder because there's also I wonder how it's like also predictable in the way that like maybe everyone just goes through it because like you're reading like Nietzsche or Schopenhauer. We looked at maybe even Hegesias would agree with this, but like it feels like everyone just is down on their contemporary philosophers of the time, right? So like, of course, Mani, he's gonna be like, they're all doing it wrong. I'm the one that's doing it right. And then, but the irony is now he has his own kind of orthodoxy that Augustine becomes the new Mani, and he's like, you're doing it wrong.
Uh-huh.
So it's also like maybe we need to have our own perspective in this and be like, well, maybe viewing it as they're doing it wrong isn't necessarily the right path, or maybe I'm just one of a million people who have gone through the same thing, right?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's a matter of doing it wrong either. I think it's a matter of like um the different ways in which people respond to the same problems over and over again throughout time. Like the fact that we're seeing, because I agree, it's not a new phenomenon either. We're seeing this kind of, we see like contemporary examples of like this kind of syncretism um in modern times. You saw it in the 20th century with like theosophy and the new age. But then you go back, centuries earlier and you see it with Mani. I think this kind of proves that this is something that people have been wrestling with a lot for um, a long time.
Yeah.
And there's just different ways in which people are responding to it, and the way that this, you know, whether it's actually a problem or whether it's just a perceived problem or not, the way that that is going to express itself is naturally going to vary from time period to time period. Like in the time of Mani, he was uniting what, like Christianity, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, and then in like the 20th century with the New Age, you see people trying to unite like, you know, Western Abrahamic religions with Indian religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on, because in like because there was a great dialogue happening between these two hemispheres of thought at that time. I mean, it had already been underway since like um, the late 19th century.
Yeah. To bring it back though, um, because I think, and this is also, I think, maybe the difference between knowledge and wisdom, because I feel like this like kind of idea of syncretism and trying to unite everything, this is more of a function of like knowledge in a way, even though I think gnosis gets associated with wisdom more. I feel like Mani's trying to be more like a knowledge, like kind of great synthesizer and not so much a mystic, even though he he has some of those traits too.
Well, it could also be motivated through like practice. Like people, you know, could find that practicing like a Christian centering prayer is effective in some way, and that chanting the Maha mantra is also effective in some other way, and they kind of get something out of both of those practices, and the fact that they come from two different traditions becomes irrelevant when you're putting both of them into practice and seeing the fruits of that bear out in your life.
Uh, yeah, the works. So maybe we can get
Mm-hmm.
into this too. I'm thinking so one reason that Augustine disagrees with the focus on gnosis is that I feel like he has this kind of idea that we can't understand God, at least not through our kind of human faculties. If we do, it's kind of like a divine revelation of some sort. And I think we see this in Christianity after Augustine. Even someone like Aquinas says that God is, we can't use the ontological argument because God is unintelligible to humans. The only person who can use the ontological argument is God. And then, like, if God's using it, then that's a little comical to think about.
Hmm.
Um, so I'm wondering if there's a motivation there to make God kind of like not a function of knowledge. And why would we want that? For example, the Epicureans think that you can understand God um like anything else that's made of matter, right? The gods are made of matter like everything else. So we can kind of rationally deduce what they're like. Um, Whereas Augustine says we have no idea what God is like. God is beyond our comprehension. Because if we could know God, we would be God, basically. That's the kind of thing. Like our knowledge is has to be incomplete because God that is complete knowledge. And if we had complete knowledge, it would be the same as being God. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you think that Mani disagrees with that?
Absolutely. Because he says that we can have gnosis. If gnosis is knowledge or wisdom of God, then he's claiming that we can have the correct idea of what God is like.
I mean, I guess that makes sense in terms of like his heavenly twin idea, which I don't
Hmm.
know that Augustine necessarily had an analog to that.
I can go into his because he's also a materialist. Manny is a materialist, and that's weird to me too. So he thinks good is like a particle. That's it's like fire, water, earth, air, good and evil. Those are the
Mhm.
six elements. And so it that's why I brought up Epicureanism because it's kind of similar to that. It's like we can know good and evil because they're just like fundamental particles of the universe that we interact with, and we're made up of both of them.
Well, I mean, it makes sense to me because this is something that comes up with Heaven's Gate, which, like I said in the last episode, I think there have been comparisons drawn between the Heaven's Gate UFO religion and Manicheism, insofar as they kind of carve this sharp dichotomy between the good world of sense and or sorry, this evil world of sense experiences and objects and bodies, and this like good world that's kind of beyond this stuff. And yet, nevertheless, the Heaven's Gate religion is fundamentally a materialist one. They don't believe in some transcendent, non-physical dimension beyond the physical world. Even their afterlife is conceived of as being located in the physical universe. It's just very far away, you know? It's not in some other dimension.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's very Epicurean too, because he thought the same thing. He thought the gods were just like atoms that were really far away from us
Mhm.
in another part of the galaxy or whatever he conceived it as. So and this is kind of gets to what we were talking about last night with um the epistemic empiricism, because it's like we're tr or sorry, the ethical empiricism, because we're trying to put this materialist sensual experience into terms of good and evil in some way. And so we're kind of deriving the empiricism not from observation, but because we it gives us the results we want for our cosmology or our
Mhm.
ethical system. I just think that's really it's a really weird way to look at it, but I feel like it's a thing that's pretty common. I think the other interesting thing too is that so Augustine has another problem with this idea that good and evil are kind of mixed together and it's just a function of um you having like good particles and evil particles. in you for two other reasons. One is that he really views evil as a defect of the will, right? Acrosia. So we're gonna go back to the will from Schopenhauer again.
Hmm.
And so if evil is a symptom of you having evil particles mixed in you in some way, then you're not really responsible for your actions. And Mani even says towards the end that like when God that they believe in a final judgment too, but their final judgment is going to be uh the good will some of the good things will be destroyed just because evil is still mixed in them in some way. So regardless of the goodness that's out there, God will have to destroy like part of himself in order to get rid of the evil too, because they're just so mixed up. And for Augustine, that's like a heresy, right? Because it's like God is divisible for one, and two, part evil. Part of God is evil in some sense. And then we're like taking the evil away from this kind of spiritual mental power in the will, and we're putting it into a material cause.
So Mani thinks that evil is just part of nature, makes up like half of nature, maybe, but Augustine disagrees with that.
Yeah, Mani thinks evil and good are literally particles in nature. Like the world is just split between evil and good particles. Because there was a war in heaven between the good side and evil side at the beginning of the universe, right? And during that war, basically the Son of God, this abstract son, not Jesus necessarily, fell into the evil world and got mixed up. And then they sent people to retrieve him. And then all the spirits of the humans, Adam and Eve, got mixed up in the evil during this time period. And so now we have this good world, this evil world, and then this mixed up world.
I mean, between the two of them, which do you think makes more sense?
I mean, honestly, I think Augustine does. I think good and evil are properties of the mind and have to do with like, maybe the intellect or the will in some way. I mean, Augustine's not a moral intellectualist, but he does recognize that it's a mental phenomena in some sense, right? Whereas I feel like Mani's almost making it like this weird physical one. I'm not, that's not my proclivity. What about
But
you?
well, I think I kind of go between both. I have a hard time picking one. I mean, I guess maybe this is part of the way in which Mani is maybe an empiricist of some kind because he might be starting out with like observations about like human behavior, seeing that people are pulled in opposing directions, and then maybe assuming that, trying to find an explanation for why that is. Like I said last time, like maybe they're starting out with the microcosmic and then moving up to the macrocosmic.
Right. I think that another thing about Mani, um, is that he's trying to answer the problem of evil as well. So why would a good, loving God create the universe in a way in which evil exists? Well, his answer is evil has just always existed. There's a good, eternal part of the universe, God, and there's an evil part of the eternal universe. That's basically Satan, or um I forgot what he calls it. But he calls it like the demon or something like that. Um, Arm Armen is what he calls it, the devil. So by making evil a fundamental force and mixed in with good, he solves the problem of evil because God is not the author of evil. Evil is just like its own self-sufficient thing. But then that introduces another problem because now God's not all powerful.
Hmm.
And I think that's where Augustine gets off the boat. And so he also says in Confessions, if I were only able to conceive a spiritual substance, but this I was unable to do. So he said he wouldn't even be a Manichean if he believed in the spiritual. So he obviously takes it that there is no room for the spirit in Manichaeism. It's all materialist. And then the last thing I thought that was interesting was he has a real problem with astrology and the idea of chance. So in the
Mhm.
Sixth God, this quote that I posted is from I think it's from Confessions, but in City of God he has like three or four chapters just raging against how astrology is wrong. And his points are really good. He kind of does it, breaks it down scientifically. He's like, well, how do you explain twins? If they're born like a minute apart, but they're exactly the same, or if they're born on the same day, but they're completely different, why do you explain some things by the star sign, but then other things you say, we can't explain them, right? It's like obvious stuff. But he's like, he thinks that the problem is really like it denies the providence of God and it can't explain the results of our choices. So like if there's a preordained kind of universe or universe is like at the whim of fortune, then that can't really explain why our choices affect reality in some sense. And so he has a problem with that and that it would affect like the providence or the meaning of the universe. Evil would be the result of a universal law and not because of a weakness of the will. Now, why would he want to make evil a weakness of the will though? Like why would he want to go against like Mani or Plato or like Aristotle even? I think Aristotle believes in acrosia too, but he doesn't think it's like a common thing, I don't think.
Well, I guess maybe he doesn't want God to be responsible for evil, right?
So that could be one reason.
And he thinks that by attributing it to the human will, it's kind of like how in 2001 he attributes it to human error, you know?
But why not put it at the level of intellect, like Plato does? Like, oh, you just don't know what the right thing is.
Well, does Plato retain that? Because I always understood it that he kind of like reneges on that later in his work.
It wouldn't surprise me if somewhere he did that because he always says that with all
Hmm.
of his views, but I can't I've read all his dialogues. I can't think of off the top of my head somewhere he does that.
Okay.
In fact, Aristotle kind of takes him to task for it a little bit, I believe. Um, I'm wondering what difference does it make if evil is an ignorance or a weakness of the will? And how does that affect maybe moral responsibility?
Well, that's what I was just gonna say. That's probably where it becomes concerning for people when we get into responsibility, which the free will debate is kind of intricately bound up with the moral responsibility debate.
Mm-hmm. Because I'm wondering, if the idea is that so Plato would say you can never knowingly do what is wrong. If you do something wrong, it's because you're in a state of ignorance as to what is right. And then the pushback would be we have some kind of intuitive notion that we know things are wrong, but we do them anyways. Like that usually is the most common response to me. What do you make of that response?
Well, I guess I always thought it was more like we don't really know that it's wrong. On some level, maybe we believe that it's right.
I mean, that would be my response to the response. Right?
Hmm.
Like that, because I'm fine with moral intellectualism to some point. I think there's some,
Yeah, I kind of am too, honestly.
but I'm just trying to get into the mindset of the person who really feels against it.
It might lead us to conclude that certain people are responsible for things that maybe that makes someone uncomfortable to think about.
I guess the other thing too, would be, what do you do with people who are ignorant but doing things that are what we consider bad? Like, how do we deal with them under moral intellectualism? But if we make it a weakness of the will, you kind of, it gets rid of the accessibility of morality, right? It's accessible to everyone now. Oh, okay, so I think I got it. Then he wants to say that the fall, since the fall, all humans are in a state of lack of grace, right? They're all in a state of sin. And so if we make acrosia a weakness of the will and not the intellect, that means that it is something that would be universal to the human condition and not something that you could just work your way out of. And that goes back to his opposition to works being a way to access salvation. I think that's what it is.
Hmm.
I listened to your one of your podcasts on forgot what you called it. It was about the like ideal early societies. What did you call them?
The lost world ideology.
Yeah, the lost world ideology. And I feel like Augustine wants Augustine wants to invert that and kind of make it like it's like the Hobbesian view
Uh-huh.
that there is a lost world, but the lost world is one of like evil and suffering that we had to climb out of by doing like a
Yeah.
social contract or like forging the church.
Yeah, the lost world ideology was just kind of like an umbrella term I kind of came up with to describe just these ideas that I see. It's kind of prevalent in certain anarchists. Like the video in question was part of my series on the abolition of work. Um,
Hmm.
and you see it in a little bit like with other other people. I noticed this with like Jeremy Griffith and the World Transformation Movement.
Yes.
Um, you see this idea that there was some ideal state at the beginning, and through one mechanism or another, usually someone coming in and ruining it or deceiving us in some way, we abandoned that, and the chief example of this is, of course, the Garden of Eden, right?
Right. But then there's also, so yeah, I get that the chief example is Eden, but then there's also this kind of Greek Roman Greco-Roman version where like the golden age had occurred and there wasn't like a deception involved. Humans just naturally um kind of fell away from what was good, like the original perfect ideal state. And so I feel like the Augustine version is more akin to like a Hobbesian, like nasty, brutish state of nature, even though it has the Garden of Eden um as its starting point. I feel like the humans don't stay in the Garden of Eden long enough for it to be like super relevant to their nature. But then I feel
Mhm.
like the Greek Golden Age that Plato talks about and Ovid, it's like being in a society is what causes the problem. Whereas with Augustine's society is more of like, and Hobbes, it's more of a solution to the problem.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I wonder if these work people are more on the Plato side of it.
The abolish work folks,
Yeah, the abolished work folk or like the ideal socialists.
the utopian socialists.
Hmm.
Yeah, could be. I don't know. I guess the heavenly twin thing was kind of interesting to me.
Hmm.
Like like you had brought up that it's kind of similar to the diamond with Socrates' diamond, right? This sort of inner voice that guides him.
What's like the interesting part of it to you?
Well, I guess this idea that he's talking to something divine, but he describes it as a twin, so it's like identical to him. It's like a maybe a good version of himself or a higher version of himself or something.
Hmm. Do you think it could be part of his materialism? Like he's literally talking to like the good particles inside of himself? Or do you think,
That's what I think.
or do you think it's like a psychological projection?
I think it's probably like this idea that, yeah, because the divine spark is like hidden in the material world, right? So maybe he's just applying that same idea to himself.
Right. Like, okay, now go along with the microcosm is the macrocosm and vice versa.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think with Socrates, it's a little different because I don't know if everyone has a diamond in his kind of worldview, right? It's like something peculiar to him. Whereas I wonder if Mani might think that anyone could have a higher self.
I don't know. I didn't see anything about that. I only saw about the heavenly twin.
Well, he has all these parallels, right? Because he has like the first man, the like higher man, and then he has literal first man, like uh Adam, right? So there's a parallel there. And then there's the highest of gods, and then there's the Son of God. And the Son of God is like the higher form of Jesus Christ, right?
Hmm.
So there's all this parallelism. There's always like a dark to every light. There's always like a material to every immaterial. Well, I guess in this world they're all material, but you get what I mean. The
Hmm.
mixed kind of world to the light world. There's like this harmony to everything. Whereas with Socrates, I feel like the diamond is, I always interpreted the diamond as being part of his epistemology. Because he talks about JTB, he always finds it unsatisfactory in some way, right? It's always missing something. And one of the potential things that he says in Mano, he doesn't bring this up in Theaetetus, I don't think, is that the missing thing could be revelation in some way. And then the diamond to me represents that. It's like some kind of intuition or revelation that kind of confirms the justified true belief for him. That's why it never tells him anything. It just tells him what's not true.
Yeah, well, the could the revelation come through recollection? Because isn't the Meno where he kind of fleshes out the theory of recollection most famously?
That would explain why it would appear to him as a diamond or like an intuition, right? There's like a paradox with recollection where you also have to recollect that it is a recollection. Because if you just remember it, but you don't remember what you're remembering, then it doesn't appear to you as though it's a recollection. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's why he might choose to characterize it as a diamond in some situations, and other situations as like a divine revelation, and then in the Meno, maybe as recollection of a like past life.
Which Mani also believed in like reincarnation and stuff, right?
Yes. And here's another thing that Augustine might be talking against or speaking against would be Origin, who also had this view that like we were reincarnated, but in a Christian sense, right? Do you know anything about Origin?
Yeah, well, you've told me about him, and I the more you told me about him, the more I started to like him. That he had this idea of reincarnation because it accounted for like how we could like we learn progressively with each life, fixing the
Yeah.
mistakes we made last time and so forth.
And the reason he wants to do that is because he wants to save the fall and say there was a fall, but he also wants to say God wouldn't leave us in this helpless position where we can never learn, or sorry, never reach salvation. He wants God to like give everyone a chance at salvation. So his
Hmm.
middle ground, middle way approach is to have a cycle of reincarnation that gives you infinite chances to become good, basically.
Yeah,
I think it's really interesting though. And
I like it.
I also think this is Augustine would be opposed to this too though, because he really wants to like have this idea of like an elect kind of specific body of people that are saved. And I don't know why he's so exclusive about it.
Yeah, well, who was he influenced by? I mean, it's because he's one of the big influencers.
I let me
He was
see if
kind of influenced by his own interpretations, I guess, right? Or unless we take that painting seriously, where the heart is shooting through his brain with a beam of light or whatever.
I think he gets it from Revelations because Revelation gives like a number of the elect, right? He's a big proponent of predestination. So the Catholic Church, they take a middle ground approach. They say grace is given by God and it's kind of predetermined, but your works do matter and they also show that you have grace, right? So they take a synthesis approach. But Augustine actually, I mean, this is why a lot of the Protestants chose to use Augustine for their interpretations because he's kind of saying no. He has almost a Calvinist approach. He's like, there's a
Yeah.
that number of people, and that's it. So that's he's interesting in that regard. As far as who influenced him in that account, I don't know. I guess it would just be the Bible. His reading of the Bible would be my guess.
Yeah, but everybody says that.
But I mean, surely some people can be influenced directly by their reading of the Bible and not some like middleman, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. I think he actually might get it from Paul because Paul had a similar view of grace. So I think it might be a combination of interpretation of Paul and revelations. Let's see. Oh, I was gonna say the other thing is that the Manicheans, remember how I told you about the meta divine realm? Or have we
Hmm.
talked about that?
Yeah.
So it appears that there's like good is kind of at a realm that's even above the concept of God and Christ. Like they're subject to the good material. They're made up of it. So good is like a property that precedes them. I think that's an interesting concept as well, because that kind of answers the Euthyphro dilemma.
The idea that God is either below morality or above morality.
Yeah, this makes God composed of something more fundamental than himself.